welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So glad to see you here tonight. I'm sure, I think a few more people will probably be coming in, but we'll get ourselves started. I'm Brenda McKinley. I'm the library director, and I'm so pleased to see you, and very pleased to be able to bring Dr. Gillis here with thanks to the Corey family, Megan and Chris Corey, who shared their daughter Madison's journey with dyslexia, and as part of the Corey Family Education Fund that we have here at the library, we're able to do some programming, and also we have some really wonderful resources up in the children's library, so please let us know if there's something that you're looking for. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Gillis. She'll speak for until a little bit before 7:30. We want to make sure we have plenty of time for your questions, and then we'll wrap up a little bit before 8. So, Dr. Margie B. Gillis, Ed and CALT, is the founder and president of Literacy How, Inc., a nonprofit organization that provides professional learning opportunities and coaching for educators on how best to implement evidence-based practices in the classroom. She has worked at the policy level through the Connecticut State Department of Education and has partnered with educators in other states to bring the research on reading and structured literacy into districts, schools, and importantly, classrooms across all tiers of instruction. She is an advisor for ReadWorks, Understood, and the International Foundation for Effective Reading Instruction, and is on the editorial board of the International Dyslexia Association, of Perspectives, and the Reading League Journal. She believes that learning to read is a civil right and that all children benefit from evidence-based instruction. So I'm very glad to welcome Dr. Margie Gillis.
I will go ahead and dim the lights a little bit so we can see the slides.
Thank you, Brenda, for that introduction, and thank you to the Corey family. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
To the Corey family for sponsoring this talk. How many of you were here? Was anybody here last year when I talked? Okay, great. I'm not doing the same talk. You'll be happy to know. You might see some slides that I shared last year, but I'm going to build on that. But no worries if you weren't here, because I'll, bring back some of the important concepts that I touched on. Just to give you a little bit of background about me. I'm actually celebrating 50 years in education this year, which is very exciting for me. I feel like I just started my journey, but it's been a great ride, and I'm not done. I started my teaching career in my basement when I was 45 years old, and I went to kindergarten. I may have told this story. My little sister, I was the 5th of 6 kids, and my little sister was really sad when I left to go to kindergarten, and every afternoon, it was half-day kindergarten, I'd come home and we'd play school. And 2 years later, she went to school herself, and the nuns were surprised that she could read. And I didn't teach her to read, obviously. I was 5 years old, but I taught her the things I was learning in kindergarten. I taught her about letters, and I taught her the sounds of letters, and she obviously was a quick study, and she picked up on a lot of it, and she was my my partner in crime, if you will, my first student. We had a lot of fun together. But I was definitely influenced by, I had 3 older brothers, and the middle brother, Jim, really struggled. And I remember so vividly as a young kid how hard it was for him to learn those letters. And he had a pack of index cards or flashcards in his back pocket. And my mom would always say, "Take out your cards, Jim." And he couldn't remember the letters. He couldn't remember the names. He was 7, 8 years old. He didn't realize he was dyslexic. None of us knew that, because in that time, people were not identified with dyslexia. So, but it impressed me as a younger sister to see my brother struggling, and I couldn't understand. Of course, how would I understand? But it inspired me. It inspired me to want to go into education. And I always knew that I wanted to teach kids to read. That was definitely something that motivated me. I went to school here in Connecticut, did an undergraduate program learned nothing, 0.0, about how to teach kids to read. And so I said, I've got to go back to school. I was planning to do that anyway. I went to UConn, did my master's 2 years after I graduated, undergraduate program, and I really lucked out because I got into a program in ed-psych, in educational psychology. Little did I know that's where the research was really happening in terms of understanding how children learn to read. It wasn't educational research that was shining a light on the cognitive psychology behind learning to read, but I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Interestingly, it was a master's in special education, and in the ed psych building, there was a special ed section of the building. So I was taking classes in special education while I was taking classes in ed psych. Diametrically opposed, totally different perspectives on reading, quite honestly. And at the time, this is 1974, there was a hypothesis that kids who couldn't read missed an important developmental stage in their early childhood years, i.e. crawling. So two researchers, Dome and Delicato, hypothesized that kids missed crawling and that at age 5 or 10 or whatever age, they had to go back and learn to crawl again. Obviously, that hypothesis was quickly dismissed. But there were all sorts of things. That was one of the crazier ones. But there was a thought at the time that visual perception was the underlying problem in learning to read. So I remember as a special ed student that we had kids doing mazes and visual discrimination tests and whatnot. Well, even today now, there's a lot of people that believe that dyslexia is a visual processing difficulty, and that is absolutely not the case. Kids are not seeing things backwards. Kids are not seeing, reversing letters because they have perceptual difficulties, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But the point is, 50 years later, now we've learned a lot about how children do learn to read. I just happen to be in the right place, as I say, at the right time, studying with a woman who was at Haskins Laboratories, and she and her research partner, Don Shankweiler and Isabel Liberman, were discovering phonological awareness, which is an underlying problem related to dyslexia. Much more complicated than that, which I will share more about. But as I said, it inspired me. I went to teach in my first classroom in Maine, and I reconnected with my husband, who's here. And he didn't know it. I didn't know it when I married him, but I diagnosed him as being dyslexic 2 years into our marriage. I kind of had an idea all along, but it was one Saturday morning, and he was like, I can't remember anybody's names. And I said, well, it's so-and-so and so-and-so. He says, I can't hear the sounds in their names. Can you say that name again? And spelling was always an issue. I said, well, maybe because you were never taught to spell, which of course is a phenomenon that we know exists better now. But at any rate, I never, I identified the dyslexia, and it made sense to him later. He's revealed many things about his childhood that came clear. Fast forward, we got married, we had 3 kids, and each of our kids struggled in different ways, but our second child specifically had difficulty learning to read, but also had attention issues, and come to find out had something called nonverbal learning disabilities. So talk about complicated and co-occurring difficulties, which is the theme for this evening, really how dyslexia rarely exists by itself. It's usually, the technical term is comorbid with other difficulties, what I call co-occurring with other difficulties, and that's what makes identifying it challenging, but even more importantly, it makes treating the dyslexia and the co-occurring difficulties more challenging. So that's the theme that I will keep coming back to. I taught kids for 25 years, took off that hat and went into professional development with teachers in 2000, and I've been doing it ever since. Literacy How is a not-for-profit organization that was established in 2009 when the grant money started to dry up at Haskins. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving that work behind. I had established relationships with lots of school districts in the state. There seemed to be a huge need. And so here we are, 15 years later, we'll celebrate this summer, the work that we're doing, primarily in Connecticut, although I've worked in other states as well, most notably Marietta, Georgia, where we have had a really great run for the last 3 years with the work that we're doing, coaching teachers in the science of reading. Long-winded background. I want to know a little bit about you, so if you could raise your hand if you're here wearing a parent hat primarily tonight. So almost all of you, okay? And those parents, are you parents of elementary age children? Okay, and what about middle, high school? So some of you have both, okay. And I won't ask the personal question, but later, if you want to share, has your student been identified? And, again, I'm assuming that some have, but maybe not all have, so I'm going to touch on that as well. How many of you are here as educators? Oh, yeah, awesome. Some of you raised your hand twice. So that's awesome because you're a parent and an educator and you wear both hats, as I do. I'll share a little bit about my most recent journey because dyslexia is hereditary, which I'll talk about. And I actually have the child I mentioned, who's now a grown adult, but I have 3 grandchildren, 3 granddaughters. 2 out of 3 have been identified with dyslexia. One just turned 10, the other one is 7. The 4-year-old, the jury's out. Although, you can see signs of dyslexia as early as 3 or 4, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that if you'd like. I will absolutely save questions, time for questions, as Brenda mentioned, so that we have a good 20 minutes, because it seems always that parents who come to these talks or have a burning question, and I'm more than happy to answer it, and hopefully it's pertinent for other people as well. I won't take questions in the middle of the talk just because sometimes it takes us off topic and then I never get through all the slides. So here we go. Literacy How is really a professional development organization that empowers teachers with knowledge. Most of you know, show of hands, if you know that Connecticut passed legislation a few years ago called the Right to Read Act. So, okay, so almost all of you are aware. The Right to Read Act is policy set in Connecticut statute that requires districts to teach the science of reading, which is really the big body of research that has informed us about how children learn to read and what best practices are related to the research, and I am going to talk a little bit more about that. So we're agnostic. For those of you who know the details about right to read legislation, there are now 9 programs that have been identified by the state as being based on science, and they're on the approved list. However, the state has also, through quite an arduous, lengthy, labor-intensive process, has also identified compendiums, so sort of casting a wider net for what districts are allowed to use to teach children to read. It's been a hotly debated topic, not just here in Connecticut, but across the country. It's extremely, let's just say, a big topic of conversation, and still no consensus, I would say, which is unfortunate. We still have a big divide as far as what people believe is this true science and what people are saying is not based on good quantitative and qualitative research. Not the point of my topic, but of tonight, but just it's relevant because it's happening right now in our state. So, what is dyslexia? This is an infographic from the National Center on Improving Literacy. Throughout this talk, I'm going to show a number of slides that have good information, but equally important, I want to just introduce you to websites and resources that you may or may not know exist, because there's so much good information out there. This particular infographic talks about the fact that dyslexia is brain-based and that it impairs the ability to read. Two big ideas. So I will show this a few videos this evening too, because I think there are some that are really good. And I think just breaks up some of the content. I wish I could get rid of some of these ads because they're annoying as heck.
All putting it on, looking in the mirror, and we're like, oh my God, this is a...
Some people find it easy to learn to read. For others, it is more difficult. Students with dyslexia may find it hard to learn how letters link to sounds, sh, how to blend sounds together into words, sh, ip, ship, and break words into individual sounds, black, b, l, a. How to read and spell new words, g, r, o, grow. Every person with dyslexia is unique and has different learning needs. Some people experience mild difficulties and others have more severe challenges. What does dyslexia look like? In class, students with dyslexia may read more slowly and with more effort, make more mistakes when reading aloud, guess words instead of reading them, spell more slowly and make more mistakes. Dyslexia is common, affecting 5 to 10% of people. Although dyslexia is a lifelong condition, people with dyslexia can learn to read and spell with the right teaching.
I went through, it's amazing how much information is out there, as I said earlier.
Hi everyone, I'm Natalie from My Progression, and this...
Thank you very much. This is supposed to move, and it's not. Darn it. Hold on. Okay, there's more than one way to do this. Just have to come out of my PowerPoint. It worked before, but it doesn't want to work now, so hold on.
I think you have to leave the full
Yeah, so if you click the bottom right corner.
Pardon?
I think you have to leave the full screen though, like click the little button in the bottom right.
Okay, thank you for saying that. All right, let me try that. Bottom right, leave, oh, there you go. See that? I learn something new every day. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. That is a good tip, appreciate that. Anyway, as I said, oh no, look what happens. Oh, that's okay. Lots of great videos, lots of great info stuff. I like this particular one because it's fairly simple. I like the fact that it recognizes dyslexia at 5 to 10%. Most people go high at 20%. Researchers will tell you there's no research to say 20%, 1 in 5, it sounds good. I think if you collectively add attention, executive function, et cetera, you probably do get to 20%. But pure dyslexia, if there is such a thing, it's 5 to 10% that has been validated through research. I think the important thing that I want to talk most about at first here is the neurological basis of dyslexia, because if we're looking for children at risk, that's the #1 question we should be asking, right? At age 3 or 4, when a parent says, I'm worried about my child, there's some things that don't seem right. They're not retaining, information. They're not able to rhyme. There's certain red flags, and you can find them, right? We talked about this last year. But the #1 question somebody should ask the parent is there a history of dyslexia in your family? Because if you have one parent who is dyslexic, you have a 50% chance of being dyslexic. If you have 2 parents, it gets closer to 75, 80%. So that's a really big question to ask, and more people now realize that there is dyslexia in the family. 25, 30 years ago, that wasn't as well known. So the neurological basis is a really important thing to note, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Another thing that is interestingly a new press that came out not too long ago, a gentleman who's studied dyslexia for years still maintains that learning to read is natural. I don't think there is a speck of evidence that that is true, and yet there are still people that believe that it is natural for us as humans to acquire reading, and that is absolutely not true. Tons of research that supports that. It is natural to learn to speak, right, and develop language skills, and those language skills are the foundation of learning to read. But learning to read does not come naturally for most children. It certainly does for some, but not all. And we know a lot from the brain research about which areas of the brain are involved in learning to read, and this is, way too, too much and too technical. But I just want to point out that there are these regions of the brain that are there for language development, language acquisition, that all of these areas actually have a role to play. The temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and then when this area of the brain, the occipital temporal lobe, is engaged and lights up, that is the signature. It's called the letter word form area, where that's the signature for, yes, this student is a fluent reader. We can tell through the fMRI imaging studies. But what also is important to note is the connections, the networks that are formed as we learn to read. Those reading networks are formed. So again, it's a neurobiological learning disabilities. We're born with these differences. But what's really important as a parent, super important, is that the brain is plastic, meaning it can change. That with good instruction, with the right environmental conditions, we can make sure that children establish that network, and that once it's established, it's there to stay. And that reading fluency is really the indicator that that's happening. So we talk to our teachers all the time about the fact that they can change brains, right? And that empowers them to really stay on top of the research, to know that what they're doing is based on the science, and also to be looking at data all the time. That's really important. And this is just the somewhat dated study, but it has been replicated in all languages, in all ages. The brain is plastic right up through adulthood. So important as parents to know that. This is a very dense slide, and as you can tell, I don't read my slides, but this is the definition according to the International Dyslexia Association. It's been around for almost 23 years now. It's widely recognized, and yet right now there are a group of scientists and researchers who are saying we need to modify this definition a little bit. I say it's still mostly right. So it is neurological. It's characterized by these difficulties in reading words. Spelling is a prevalent problem that continues. It's unexpected in relation to cognitive abilities. It just means that it's not related to intelligence. But it is related in some respects to what kind of instruction you receive, what the learning environment is. It's also important to note secondary consequences are that if you're not reading, you're not building your reading comprehension, right? You're not building your vocabulary, you're not building your background knowledge. So it's really important for children who don't like reading because it's hard to motivate them to read as much as you can, but also to accommodate the fact that they're not reading, which is, having them listen to books on tape and reading aloud to them, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to show you a few myths versus fact slides, again, just to dispel a couple things that are important. The one here that's stating the fact that all students with dyslexia demonstrate the same problems with reading, and that is not the case. I won't go into the weeds on that, but it's really important for us to recognize that dyslexia looks different. Some children persistently have difficulty building reading accuracy and automaticity and fluency. Others, once they get really good instruction, get pretty good at reading. They may not be fast. They may not read prosodically, but they're decent readers, and where they continue to struggle is with spelling and written expression. So it's, as part of this, it's also important to recognize that there is a continuum of severity when it comes to dyslexia. So from mild to severe, and that has implications for instruction, because it means that children who might get okay in Tier 1 instruction, because that Tier 1, only of that Tier 1 instruction is really strong, and that it is data-driven, that it is individualized for the students' needs. So the Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, most of you know this. Tier 1 is the general education curriculum or classroom. Tier 2 is usually exists, I shouldn't say exists, it occurs during Tier 1, so that the general education teacher is expected to do the Tier 1, but might also be delivering Tier 2 in the regular classroom. I don't know what happens here in Ridgefield. I'm assuming you're all parents in Ridgefield, but districts do it differently across the state and in the country. So some districts have individual reading interventionists that deliver the Tier 2 instruction outside of the classroom. Some push into the general education classroom. But the point is, it's in addition to, and that's important, it's in addition to the general education curriculum, so that the children don't miss what's happening in Tier 1. It's very important that it is in addition to. Another important consideration is that it is aligned, right, to Tier 1. And I could tell stories about that lack of alignment from my grandchildren's experiences, but I won't go off topic. Just important that these systems and these tiers are aligned, and equally important, I think, to say that the teacher's knowledge and expertise needs to increase with each tier. So children who end up being eligible for special education are going to receive Tier 1 instruction. They may receive Tier 2 and Tier 3 for a period of time before they're identified. And oftentimes, this is hopefully not true in Ridgefield, but I've seen it fairly frequently, where special education teachers know less about reading than the reading interventionists and the reading specialists. And in part, that's because, and having been trained in special education, that's my roots are there, I still see it today, because they have to accommodate all the different learning disabilities. So they have to learn about dyslexia, autism, comprehension difficulties, behavior problems, and when you are the jack of all trades and master of none, right, it's hard to go deep into one area. So if I had a magic wand, I would change how special education is organized, and particularly it's how special education teachers, the support they receive. Again, I won't go off topic, but just mentioning that. So as we're talking about dyslexia, identifying dyslexia is extremely important, and it's not easy. Let me just say that. It is, to do it well, I wish there was one dyslexia test, and there isn't. I wish there was one assessment, that's it, you are, you're not. It doesn't work that way. It requires a number of different assessments that not only are administered, but analyzed really thoroughly and well. Because again, it's not simple. It's not like just look at these 5 numbers and there you go, you've got your identification. There's many different things to consider. Reading Rockets, I'm sure most of you know, it's an amazing website with information for all stages of knowledge with regard to everything educational. But I like this particular, I'm calling attention to this particular part of the website if you want to read a really good, thorough description of identifying dyslexia. This does one of the best jobs I've seen. I'll also show you this little video. Hopefully. Or not. Let's see. Oh, never mind. I wasn't going to show you a video here. I just want to show you what you'll see here. Can you hear me okay?
Mhm.
Okay. So you see it's Dyslexia Defined. This is a great video by Tim Odegaard. And then it just talks about universal screening, dyslexia-specific diagnostic screening, tiered interventions, and a whole lot more. So I want to just point you to some information that I think might be helpful, because diagnosing is always a challenge. Another thing I want to mention before I move on is this thing called the dyslexia paradox. How many of you have heard of the dyslexia paradox? Just a few of you. It's a well-known dyslexia paradox that early intervention works best for children with dyslexia. Not just dyslexia, any disability, any learning disability. Early is best. Yet most diagnoses do not occur before second or third grade. You can't identify dyslexia before a child is taught to read because it is a reading disability. However, you can find kids who are at risk at age 3, 4, 5, and that's important. Why? Because we know that if we start teaching certain things and really adhering to some of the evidence-based practices that are good, good evidence, a good research methodology for young children that are in preschool or waiting till kindergarten is much more effective than waiting till later. And I can talk firsthand about that from, as I said, my 2 grandchild who went too long, and shame on me in part. I carry some guilt about that because, here I am, somebody who studied and learned and practiced this for many years, and yet kind of, didn't miss the boat entirely, but didn't do as much as I wished I had, because they're having the older one is having some difficulties. So what is it like to have dyslexia? I thought that I would play, I'm not going to play this whole video, but I like the video because it does give us some insight. If you have a child, you might show this to them. So this is from the Learning Ally website, another great resource, amazing information here. Lots of free webinars that you can sign up for. Their work is really stellar. And I don't think we're going to have to watch an ad. Yay.
Dyslexia is a learning disability type thing, and it affects me in reading, but I also have dysgraphia, which affects me in spelling and writing. One thing that I have trouble with is I can't read my writing, so when my teacher asked me to read out loud my writing, I can't because I can't read my writing.
It's not a huge difference. I'd say definitely don't let it get in your way and think that it's a downside or a negative. It's just a different way of learning, and you might just need to do some different stuff or whatever works for you.
Dyslexia doesn't mean you're stupid. It means you're really smart and different than other people.
So if you're not average, that could mean many things. It's like you might be worse in some areas, like I was worse in reading and writing, but you might excel in other things like math for me, science. I enjoy those greatly.
I'll just pretend I'm sick, I can't go to school, because I'll be so far behind on work, so I won't understand even what unit we're on anymore. I stopped doing homework. I dropped my grades so low. I nearly didn't even pass the grade.
When I was younger, I was reading way below grade level, and it was really hard. I'm really good at comprehending what the story is trying to say, but actually reading through all of the words was really hard. So I got over that, and now I'm reading above grade level, but still. When somebody makes fun of me, I tell them I just have a different way of thinking, a different way of doing stuff.
The lowest moment I ever had in school was probably in 2nd grade, and none of my papers were hung up in the hallway, and on Fridays we would always get an extra recess, and I never got to go out for that. I always had to sit on the wall and do my homework because I needed extra help and I didn't get it, and I just couldn't get it. I tried very hard, but I couldn't get it. I didn't get the same possibilities that everybody else did. They never saw what I wrote, they never understood it, so it didn't really mean anything.
Homework is an experience. It usually takes me 5 or 6 hours to do not all of my homework. I can get 3 assignments done maybe, and it hurts my mind, and sometimes if I have lots to do, I even wake up early and do more homework.
We would have these coded books on which color you were, and of course, me being a dyslexic, I was in the lowest color. You kind of feel alone at the very beginning.
Because I played the whole thing. Did you relate to some of that?
Not everybody finds it easy. Some people find it hard.
Okay. Thanks for that tip. That was great. So, dyslexia may co-occur with other learning disabilities, and I'm going to walk through each of these in turn, just to give some insight about each of them, and also noting that co-occurring challenges also include anxiety, depression, and social emotional problems that often are secondary to the dyslexia and outcome. So the first one I want to talk about is dysgraphia. One of the children in the movie talked about dysgraphia. Does anyone here have a child who's been identified with dysgraphia? So several of you have. It's a specific learning disability that affects how easily children acquire and use written language. It takes many forms. It's often characterized by poor letter writing by hand, but it's also characterized by poor spelling as well. So it's not necessarily a primary developmental motor disorder. That's what we used to think. And now we know it's more than that. It has as much to do with spelling as it does writing. Some of the characteristics of dysgraphia include these. Another magic wand I would wave, if I could, is teaching children to write in preschool, to hold a pencil correctly, to write letters correctly, not kill and drill and kill, whatever it is, because that's not the point. But some of you may know, it's really difficult to change habits, even at the tender age of 5 or 6. Once a child has established a pencil grip, it's really difficult to change that habit. And pencil grip matters greatly because kids, have you noticed the grip of your children? If they're holding the pencil incorrectly, they have very little stamina to write. They tire easily. So it really matters the grip. There are some great grips you can buy, and I highly recommend that you find one that your child will use on a pencil because it forces them to use the correct grip. But the letter formation is also a big part of it. And this is an example of a 4th grader. He wrote, "I like to go quadding a play outside. I quad with the neighbors to the right of us, also across the road, but I always want my dad." And I'm not sure what the word in front of that is, my dad quad. Now, this student, as I said, was 4th grade, labeled not only dyslexic but dysgraphic. And you could see some of the things that were alluded to in the symptoms or the description of student with dysgraphia. Just letter formation is difficult for him. He really struggled. He couldn't remember how to form the letters. They're all squished together. It's a combination oftentimes of upper and lowercase letters, etc. He decided that he wanted to learn cursive. And he worked with an occupational therapist for not too long, maybe 2 months. And it's hard to see this writing sample, but this says, next week is Thanksgiving. I'm looking forward to playing knee hockey with my cousins. You know, again, it's hard to see this, but he really, really worked hard to learn cursive. I saw his mom a couple of years ago, and I asked her if he was still using cursive, and she said no. And that's often the case. People say to me, is it a good idea to teach my child cursive? And having taught many kids with dyslexia over the years, I always taught them cursive writing, but that was 25, 30 years ago. Now, what do you think the biggest impediment is to teaching a child, or the reason for not doing it? What?
I just wanted to say, as a retired teacher, students can't read cursive.
Exactly, because teachers aren't writing cursive. And no, this is not a blame any teacher. It's just that years ago, 3rd grade and on, everything I as a teacher wrote on a board was written in cursive. That's the only way you're going to learn to read cursive, is if you practice reading it. And of course, you write it and then you read it, and they go hand in glove. So as much as I love the idea of cursive, and there's good reason for it, because it flows, it's easier to write those letters because they're very different. Like a B and a D is challenging because they look so similar. A B and a D cursive, the approach stroke is different. Everything about it is different. But again, there's practical reasons for maybe not doing it. You have to figure out where you put your focus, and that probably isn't one that I would say. Now, does that mean I wouldn't want you to ask for handwriting instruction be embedded in the instruction for children? I still think it's good practice, because it's a multimodal way of teaching letter sound, spelling, all that, getting the handwriting in there. All right, the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is ADHD. And I just selected a very simple, not really description of it, but just, well, a mini description. So I'll let you read that. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, right? The children who are identified with ADHD can't control their impulses. It's very difficult for them to do that. And just as dyslexia is neurologically based, so too is ADHD. Actually interesting that some parts of the brain may be smaller and take longer to develop. This is a fairly new finding. Brain structures and pathways as a result may be less efficient. Frontal lobe plays a key role. We've known that a long time. The frontal lobe is the last part of the brain to develop, and it develops more slowly by and large for boys, which explains a lot. That's a joke. It's often referred to as the brain self-management system or executive control circuit, and some common signs of and symptoms of ADHD are these. There are 3 types of ADHD. So there's the hyperactive, and then the inattentive type, and then the combined type, right? So you can be one of 3, and again, that makes identifying children with ADHD, or individuals, not just children, more challenging. So how is it diagnosed? Again, it's not easy. Just like dyslexia is not easy, that's a big problem in schools, because personally, I think special education teachers should be in on the actual administering of the assessments and learning how to at least read the results and interpret them to some extent, but they get very little training in that. So it falls to the school psychologists, and not all school psychologists are well versed in reading, sadly. They should be, but they're not all. In this case, different types of specialists can diagnose ADHD. There's no one test, so very similar to dyslexia. A full ADHD evaluation is an in-depth process that has many elements, often done by, obviously, a psychologist. Pediatricians do not know enough about ADHD, nor do they know, as they know even less about dyslexia. Again, another big wand I would wave, because they are the people that see children, especially in the first few years of life. They should really be on the lookout for the signs and be able to say to a parent, yes, I see some of this too, I would pursue help. So anyway, rating scales are often used to make the diagnosis, as you probably know. If you've gone through that, the Connors, there's lots of different behavior scales. So a parent, a teacher, will rate the child according to the many different criteria, and then you see disparity, which is always very interesting, because you often see different things rated high by a parent and less so by the teacher, and vice versa. So your behavior is different, and we know that. My daughter is pulling her hair out sometimes because her kids are beautifully behaved in school, and they come home and they act like, different kids. And I can identify, I remember so clearly, why is that? Well, I think the kids work super hard to keep it together during the school day. And when they get home, they are exhausted, they're played out, and it all comes out. And mom is usually the one that is the recipient of a lot of that. Very challenging. Another great resource is Attitude, which is ADD magazine. It's been around for 25 years. These are just a list of myths. So just like there's a lot of myths associated with dyslexia, there's many, many myths associated with ADHD. So you can find this on the website. I'm just really wanting to share resources as much as anything else. Treatment for ADHD. Many ways to treat and help manage the symptoms. They range from medicine to therapy. The second paragraph here is important studies have shown medication works well for about 80% of the population. And yet I would say that 90% of the parents I talk to push back when they are told that medication is a good option for them. And I get it, I did that same thing. You feel like you don't want to drug your kid, right? And I'm going to give them this medicine, it's going to change their personality. I will say this, we've come a long way in the 50 years since I've been practicing. And we've learned a lot more about the role that medication can play in treating especially something like ADHD, and there are lots of options. So I understand more and more about the role that that plays. So one thing that comes up a lot is, where does executive function come into play when we're talking about ADHD? And honestly, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between those two things. So it says here, individuals with ADHD, by and large, by definition, struggle with executive function, executive skills. They all reside in the frontal lobe, and this is just the definition of those executive functions, the cognitive processes that we as humans use to plan, organize, control, regulate our resources. And children and people, we have, right, ADHD and dyslexia is a lifelong situation. Doesn't go away when you graduate from college or high school. It stays with you. It changes over time, but it certainly stays with you for your life because it's neurologically based. And some of these things that are mentioned here, including working memory, which is your ability to hold on to information and do something with it. I gave the example of multiple step math problem. So much of what we do in school relies on working memory, especially comprehension. If you're reading something and it's a long sentence, and we teach about syntax to our teachers all the time, and we give examples of long sentences that have multiple clauses. For a child with working memory difficulties, they don't remember the first part of the sentence by the time they get to the end of it if they have difficulties with working memory. Certainly cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control are also at work in everyday life, not just school. So again, this idea of executive function is the management system of the brain, and how important it is that we recognize that this is going to have an impact on learning. Now, one more co-occurring difficulty that I want to talk about is developmental language disorder, or DLD. How many of you have heard of DLD? Most people have not, so if you haven't, that's what I'm finding. So DLD is difficulty with language. And interestingly, again, it's a neurobiological disorder. What I'm learning more and more about, because this is becoming more and more on the forefront, is that a large population of kids, 10%, which is close to how many are dyslexic, have developmental language disorder. And I don't have time to go into all of it, but this is the website that I would recommend that you go to, dldandme.org. It's got a lot of great information on it, including great video of a mom talking about her child. So some of the things that you see here, more repetitions to learn, which is true for kids with dyslexia too, trouble remembering words, struggling to put words together. So there's definitely differences. If you look at this slide, you can see that if you're familiar with this concept of the simple view of reading, how many of you have heard of the simple view, where we have two very distinctly different skill sets that children have to master to be good at reading? One is they have to be able to read words automatically, and that is the thing that is underlyingly, or is most prevalently difficult for a child with dyslexia, because they have problems with the phonological system. They have trouble with decoding and spelling, right? The contrast to that is a child who has trouble with comprehension, listening, expressing themselves with language, and that child might be identified with DLD. What's interesting, though, is that now more and more, and we at Literacy How do conduct some independent educational evals, we are seeing more children come to us with a diagnosis or identification of dyslexia and DLD, which you can imagine makes remediation and intervention more challenging. And then, as I mentioned earlier, co-occurring challenges are social emotional problems, and you heard several of the children talk about that, that you saw on that little video clip that I shared. Stress and anxiety, our kids are stressed out, period. But you add a learning disability to the equation, and you see how great an impact that has on anxiety and raising anxiety, and ultimately could lead to a diagnosis of depression. So what can we do? What can you do as a parent, as a teacher? First, learn as much as you can, which is why I wanted to share the resources in the website. Advocate, and then teach your child to advocate. One of my middle child still is not good at advocating for herself, and as much as my husband and I kept trying and doing everything in our power, some children just are in denial and don't want to talk about it, and it's really challenging when a child says, I don't want to talk about it, and pretends that the problem doesn't exist. So find ways to get your child to feel okay about it. Maybe they're not going to love it, but feel okay ultimately about it. Certainly, as I've said, strive for prevention and early intervention. Insist on evidence and research-based interventions, also known as the science of reading. And that's another talk for another day. Get involved in your child's school and insist on professional development for teachers, because teachers don't get enough of it, and that's, again, because there's limited time, right? There's limited time to do these things, but to me, it's one of the most important things that teachers need to feel supported. Smart Kids with Learning Disabilities is another great organization that's based here in Connecticut, in Fairfield County. They have wonderful programs that they offer for free. Their website is very comprehensive, so I check that out. In the end, the treatment of dyslexia is educational. So many parents look for some magic silver bullet. They'll take out a second mortgage to send their child to a special program, to get visual, perceptual treatment, to find a way to help the child succeed in school. And 90% of the time, those in the fundamental problem, which is that they can't read and spell very well. So look for an academic educational treatment is the bottom line. One of the things too that's important to know as a parent is to ask for progress monitoring. I know there's a lot on the slide here, but I'll just distill it really quickly. The only way we know if kids are going to respond to instruction, if it's a good intervention, is to take data and to do it on a regular basis so that you know before too much time has passed that it's working or not. If it's not working, you need to change course. So this just speaks to that. There's no silver bullet, which I've talked about. By the way, this infographic is on the National Center on Improving Literacy, so you can find the whole fact sheet. So what we know instruction must be for kids with dyslexia and co-occurring learning disabilities. It must be explicit, meaning we're teaching the skills directly. It's systematic, meaning it follows a sequence that's well articulated and all the materials are aligned to that sequence. It focuses not just on phonics, but it also focuses on comprehension. So kids shouldn't be just reading words and word lists isolated. They should be pulling those words from the text that they're reading or the text that they're studying. Comprehension is very important. I've mentioned the importance of the assessments that drive the small group instruction. There's a whole, as I said, I specifically showed you that link for the Reading Rockets because it does a really nice job of kind of parsing out the identification and the assessments that are associated with dyslexia. It should be multi-componential, and by that I mean, phonemic awareness, I don't know if Ridgefield uses Haggerty, but Haggerty is pervasively used around the country. I think the vast majority of schools use it to teach phonemic awareness. It's a well-respected program, but I see it misused. And I can't, again, go into detail about that unless there's a follow-up question, but my idea here, the idea I want to present to you is multi-componential means we can teach phonemic awareness is teaching kids to be able to hear the sounds and segment, blend, etc. But we can do it in the context of teaching them the phonics and at the same time bring meaning so that the kids aren't just randomly reading the words, that they know what the words mean. Vocabulary is part of that. Not as imperative in a place like Ridgefield, but in a place like Bridgeport where children have a lack of vocabulary knowledge and they're practicing reading nonsense words. It is not a good use of their time when they're so far behind in terms of what they know about the world and their vocabulary skills. But even here in Ridgefield, it's just good practice to bring all of those structures into play. And then keeping the instruction going until mastery is achieved. That's a really important concept. It's difficult because kids will start to make a good steady climb in their reading skills, but their spelling plateaus. And it's hard to know when to kind of deviate, like not deviate, but let the reading keep going and still work where this on the children's spelling level. So again, some more weedy stuff, but important just to think about. Whoops, went the wrong way. Couple more things and then I'm going to take your questions. The intervention or the approach that is grounded in the science of reading that's most widely recognized is called structured literacy. Everybody heard the term structured literacy? If you haven't, you're in luck. You can go to the IDA website and you can download the 75th anniversary issue of Perspectives for free. It is extremely comprehensive journal that is 60 pages and has the great researchers and practitioners in the field writing very detailed information about what it is. It's equivalent to Orton-Gillingham. If you've heard of Orton-Gillingham, it's a similar kind of approach. It is not a program, although there are programs that would be considered structured literacy. The one that's most widely known about is Wilson, but there are 25 others out there that are programs that are basically aligned to the science and would be considered structured literacy. What do we still need to know? We still need to know which interventions are most effective for students that are dyslexic and have recurring learning disabilities. As I said, that's very challenging because there are all these other variables that interact with and make the instruction more complicated. How much instruction students need to reach mastery, we don't know that. Research studies have been conducted and it's not definitive to what that looks like. And we also don't know how to integrate structured literacy instruction into, and I forgot the last bullet, into our content areas. So that's also important. One more infographic, this comes from the National Center on Learning to Improving Literacy, NISL, and this is just the importance of you, the parent, learning about your child's reading development as you have come tonight to do and understand better, and then exploring these resources so you can learn more. So on that note, I will end. I'm sorry I went over my time, but I'm happy to stay with you until they kick us out of the library at 8 o'clock. So questions? Yes?
Well, I have a lot of questions.
I know, and I just dumped a whole bunch of information, so please.
Well, so for my son, when he was in first grade, he was 16th percentile in reading. So right away, I guess during that summer, first grade going into second, he was very below in reading and math. So I got a tutor, Orton-Gillingham trained. He is diagnosed in first grade. I noticed some things at home. He's diagnosed with ADHD, but he's not a hyper kid, not physical, not a physical bouncing off the walls like what you think maybe, but he's more of the brain. He's always going, yep, always talking. So he is on medication for that, so the school would recognize that he has ADHD. He has a 504 plan. My struggle with the school, and once when a child is diagnosed with ADHD, I also believe he's dyslexic. I'm dyslexic, we have people in the family that are, but at the school, it seems as though everything is just really ADHD. That's why he's, words that he knows, sight words, he gets stuck on. Other words like talk, he'll make a word using all the letters, but scramble them, and I couldn't even do that if I tried.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of genius. But there's other, fluency is not there. I've had a tutor the whole summer, all this year, and the fluency, and great tutor, and that school he gets, he's in tier 2. But still, you would seem to think after all this that he'd be.
What grade is he in?
He's in second.
Okay.
So I guess how do you, it stinks once when a child has ADHD because everything is blamed on that. Well, no, he's not dyslexic. I believe he's dyslexic. I was almost going to have him evaluated, but now that I'm working with an Orton-Gillingham tutor, it's almost, and they've given him some tests of dyslexia, like the sub-tests. But, and I don't think if I paid all that money to go to a neuropsychologist, because the tutoring agency sent it over. But then where do I go? Do I
Yeah.
just continue with the tutoring? Because even at school, now I guess I'm very lucky that his reading teacher just recently got certified to be an Orton Gillingham.
So let me answer that question for you personally, but also try to be somewhat generic, not generic, but broader, that may be pertinent, because you're asking an important question. And this is interesting, because I mentioned my granddaughter, who I taught to read at age 5, which during COVID, we did it on Zoom, believe it or not, and she learned to decode. We used decodable text. She loved it. And I worked with her, every day, and because of that, it masked the dyslexia, to be honest with you. So you hired a tutor, which is great, because you gave your child in first grade, before it became more problematic, the underlying, important foundation, and he's not reading fluently at this point, and that was true for my granddaughter. As time went on, it was clear, even though she was getting good instruction, and remember, that was part of the definition I shared with you, right? In spite of good instruction, they're still not responding to what they should be. If a non-dyslexic child got the same instruction, they would be taking off and reading beautifully. The fact that he has not made progress is probably a very good indicator that he is, but you've helped compensate for that by giving him good instruction. And of course, that's a dilemma, right? Because part of you says, well, wait, the only way he's going to be eligible is if he fails. And in fact, years ago, we had a weight to fail discrepancy model. Kids had to be 2 years or more below grade level to qualify for services. We've gotten rid of that, fortunately, here in Connecticut and most other states as well. But the point I'm making is that you're helping compensate for that. I would say the best thing to do is talk to the school and say, and I need more tests, and chances are good that they'll do that. And at the same time, ask for data for what he's doing in his, especially in his tier 2 intervention, to see if what they're giving him is closing the gap, because we have, you really have to look at the benchmark goals for the different parts of reading.
It's very interesting. He's made progress. Obviously, he's made some progress. But if I didn't have the tutor, where would he be? That's what I'm scared about. And
Right.
now going into next year, now I'm like, financially, do I pull the tutor, but then do I then let him fail and then lose all that information? Like you said, it's good to know that your mind can be molded if I can keep it up. But I don't know.
It's a dilemma. I'd like to take other questions, but I think that, it's a question that you want to think about. But at the very least, I would recommend talking to the school and getting more data to make an informed decision. Yes?
I just might share that as a retired teacher and children with learning disabilities, now a granddaughter with dyslexia, that there can be a distinction between the testing that a school will do and independent testing.
Totally, yes.
And sometimes, I know my children's had some issues, the school said there was no problem. I had to go to the independent. And once you have the independent, the school has to follow that, but you've created sometimes a little dichotomy. They said they don't, you said you do. They will follow your independent testing, but sometimes if you're that strongly feeling about the dyslexia, I give advice, can I say, I would recommend that you get an independent neuropsych evaluation.
Or maybe not a neuropsych, but an educational eval. I personally think educational eval is more helpful because speaking from experience, you're going to get testing that includes achievement testing, testing phonological processing, and a neuropsych is going to tell you more about attention, that type of cognitive function, which you already know. What you're looking for is how is he doing, performing in the classroom, and to your point, and why I mentioned, oftentimes school psychologists, and again, anybody here is the school psychologist for Ridgefield, this is not, it may not be pertinent to you, but my experience, many years, is that school psychologists don't receive the training in administering reading assessments, specifically administering writing assessments, because I didn't talk about writing tonight at any length, but what kids with dyslexia, 99.9% of them struggle with writing, and attention deficit just compounds that problem. So another question, yes?
Would you recommend then that she start with a school comprehensive eval first before she go and do an outside eval?
I mean, certainly that would be the first place, because I've seen good assessments come out of the schools too. And if that doesn't yield the right information, then you go to Plan B, which is an IEE, an independent educational eval.
I did have a question about the DLD. Is that classified under SLD, or
No.
would be speech and language?
No, it is not classified under SLD, and that's a problem. I think it's becoming more, and the reason I now talk about it more broadly is because most people have not heard of it before, DLD. It's lumped together, honestly, with other comprehension-focused difficulties. So it could be in the language domain of, it usually is, of specific language impairments, specific comprehension difficulties. And most often it is identified by the speech and language pathologist. But it's very difficult to get a speech and language evaluation. You really have to flag a lot of problems early on, and that's why there's a push to do. It's difficult to screen for language difficulties. The only people that really actually do language evals are SLPs, and their caseloads are large, and just not enough of them to go around, and it's a very labor-intensive process. The people that are doing the research at Tiffany Hogan and her colleagues at Mass General are doing really great research now to come up with a screener that is similar to a DIBELS, where it's a quick and dirty 10-minute assessment, flag the kid, and then if there are a number of warning signs, then they would go to the next step, a more comprehensive eval by an SLP. So great question. Yes. Yep. You.
I teach reading, middle school reading, and a lot of my students are English language learners.
Mm-hmm.
And something I'm struggling with is teasing out what could be dyslexia versus what is just, the student just needs more time learning English and learning how to read English. Do you have any resources or anything that are helpful?
Yes. Email me and I'll send you a PowerPoint of really great. Laura Reynolds, who's a professor at Southern Connecticut, her PhD was in dyslexia and kids with English learners. And just what you said, figuring out what is the language difficulty associated with learning English and what is an underlying phonological based learning disability, i.e. dyslexia. And oftentimes these kids don't get identified because it's assumed that their problems are driven by the fact that they're learning English as a second language, and English is a very difficult language to learn because of its writing system, its orthography. So definitely email me and I'll send you. It's great. It's a great PowerPoint. It's a great piece of work. Yes?
I'm actually curious because you're focusing kind of on dyslexia and there's dysgraphia and dyscalculia and all this other dyslexias, right? And my son has always been great at reading. And I go to spelling and comprehension for math.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always suspected that he's had dyscalculia. You can have that without having dyslexia.
Yes, you can.
Okay. Because, well, I keep on getting like gaslighted, just like this lady here. They're saying that my son has ADHD and that's why he's having problems. I don't think that's the case.
It might not be, but worth looking into. Dyscalculia, it's pronounced different ways. I say dyscalculia. No, it's fine. Just whatever you want to call it. Difficulty with calculation with math is does co-occur with dyslexia, but not always. So all of these things I've talked about tonight can occur by themselves, right? Just the topic of today's talk was really thinking about dyslexia but yes, in fact, dysgraphia is not always co-occurring with dyslexia, nor is attention deficit always co-occurring. Dyscalculia would be interesting to know and think about and just read up on it. I think the best place to look for information, Understood has a lot on dyscalculia, and Ed.D online is another great resource. But does he have difficulty? Sort of a rhetorical question, you don't have to answer it, but is it computational difficulty, or is it because he has difficulty comprehending the word problems? Because you mentioned that he also has problems with comprehension, which would lead me to think that it could be the latter or it could be both. But knowing the difference, because some children are very good with computation, but where they fall down, and this is a classic dyslexic kid who can do the computation and may be strong in math, but they have difficulty because they can't actually read the problems. And they might have trouble with the symbols, the multiplication sign, the addition sign, the fractions, all of the things that are, math has its own language, its own set of symbols that kids with dyslexia might also struggle learning. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned that once you have a diagnosis, there should be regular check-ins to make sure that there's progress being made. Can you explain what good looks like when we just had our diagnosis and I'm not sure how frequently and what kind of information I should be asking for?
What grade is she in?
She's in 4th grade.
4th grade, okay. So the most commonly used screener, first of all, I should say Connecticut has a policy that kindergarten through 3rd grade students have to be screened 3 times a year. So all districts in the state of Connecticut, thankfully, are adhering to that policy. It's a really important one, right? So your child might have been flagged last year or some point in time because she is a girl.
Yes.
She didn't meet the benchmarks, and so things went into motion and she was identified. Now, what's really important is that you have diagnostic assessments that pinpoint exactly what the nature of the problem is, because screenings don't do that. So you do more of a deep dive into the specific aspects of reading and spelling that she struggles with. Also, where she is in the scope and sequence. As I mentioned, when you're teaching kids to read words and decode and spell, you follow a sequence, and that is your roadmap. So you have to know where she is in that sequence, and then it's the job of the teacher to do what are called progress monitoring, otherwise known as probes, that are very easy to administer. They should take no more than 5 minutes, and the farther a student is behind and where they should be, the more frequently those progress monitoring probes should be administered. Because 4th grade isn't terribly late, but it's not optimal, right? Learning to read occurs in the first few years, up till maybe 2nd grade, latest 3rd. By 4th grade, it's expected that she's reading to learn. So now you have to play catch up on the foundational skills. So you really want to do more frequent progress monitoring so you're sure that she's receiving an intensive enough intervention that you're going to close the gap. That makes sense?
Yes, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
What is a probe?
It's a dipstick. It's like we do a quick 2-minute nonsense word reading task or phoneme segmentation task, or read a set of words with a phonetic pattern that the student is working on. Yes?
What do you feel about how they're using computers nowadays to write everything out? Is that good or bad for, because I keep on hearing conflicting things, like it's actually good for them because they're seeing, their mistakes being changed like automatically, but I don't think that that's
all that?
I think it's really important to stick with paper, pencil up till about second or third grade. Like handwriting is really important, as I said before. And there's lots of research that writing by hand has a longer lasting impact in terms of remembering what you're learning. And they've done a lot of studies even with college age students that when they take the notes by hand versus typing them into the computer, they actually have better recall of that information. So there's definitely good reason why we should still be doing some of that in the early grades. By the time you get to fourth grade, I think that's a turning point for kids with dyslexia particularly, who have really very weak spelling and very weak written expression skills. Assistive technology is a must. They have to really leverage what the technology will help them do so that it doesn't disadvantage them too much for taking the time, making the spelling errors, etc. So assistive technology, which I should always incorporate into these talks, is really, really important. Having a good assistive technology evaluation is also extremely important because there's so much that's out there, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not like in lieu of, right? You're still going to want to build the other skills and encourage the kids to do the writing by hand, but it's the assistive technology that will level the playing field for them and allow them to absorb all the information they have to absorb in the middle and high school grades that they just can't do by themselves without that. And written expression too. So I think we are at 7:56, and Brenda's going to kick us out. So
Never.
She's not going to kick us out. But one last question, if there's a quickie. Yes.
You had mentioned about we don't want to feel like we're drugging our kids. That really personally rang for me because I do have, I did get cleared in the school of a good academic evaluation. And she has dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADHD. And it was really helpful and a relief for me to know that she had that we could identify what it was, because I knew for a long time there was something wrong. And they said well, she has a disability, but they couldn't say it until finally. Anyway, so we have, I had been doing tutoring. I got a tutor who is helping with dyslexia, which I'm really grateful for, but also ADHD. I now have my first bottle of these Vyvanse.
What is it called?
Vyvanse.
Never heard of it.
Anyway, I think that's what it's called. It's an ADHD medicine. And I'm going out of town and I'm going to come back and then I want to fully watch her. But I'm terrified.
Yeah.
I'm just
and I think that's just a normal reaction.
Of
and
man, I'm drugging my kid. I feel like I failed.
No, I know the feeling. I felt it firsthand, and I see my daughter struggling with it now, and I totally understand. So I think you're doing the right thing by just educating yourself, observing her behavior. Here's what I would suggest that you do is talk to a parent, a mom, who's had good experience with medication for ADHD.
Right here, I can.
I think it's really helpful to talk to a parent, right? Because they can tell you that it's okay, and this is a game changer for them. And that's what I hear over and over again. It's a game changer for them. It is because, again, it's a neurobiologically based difficulty, and there is chemical imbalance. You can explain it's no different than being a diabetic and taking insulin, or you name the difficulty and the drug that puts the system back in regulation. I totally understand, and years ago it was a different thing, but 50 years later now, we know so much more about the chemistry, about the biology, about the neurobiology. So I would talk to a parent and feel feel it out that way. And then do your own work with, like you said, observing the behavior and noticing the changes. Write everything down because you won't remember, but it will be helpful. And on that note, I'm going to end because I know it's now 7:59. Thank you so much for being with me this evening. Really enjoyed it.